Now we've understood the difference between a presentational and container component at a high level, we're also going to talk about one-way data flow and how it ties into Angular. So let's assume our component tree again. We have our service at the top and it's being somehow tied into this top component. It's giving it some data and we actually want to tell it to render down into these components. Now we're going to learn how to do this, but it's also good to learn how the data should be flowing. So let's assume that our service has just made an HTTP request, it's gone off to our API, and we want to pass that down from our container component down into the stateless children. So these arrows essentially represent the data being passed down from the top to the next component. And then again, if we want to pass data even further down the tree, we can do this also. So we're going to learn how to do this in these next few videos, but at a high level, this is how you should be thinking. So let's assume that our component has now been rendered and a user makes a change. So this could be typing in an input box or clicking a button or anything that you're creating that a user can interact with. So let's assume that we've just made a change and our data has flowed down into each component. How do we get this change back up to our container component so that it can update the service should it need to? Now we do this through something called events. So Angular has something called event emitter built in, which we'll look at shortly. So let's assume that our data has come down, a user has made a change. Now what we do is pass this data back up via an event. So we don't use two-way data binding, we use one-way data binding, which is essentially one-way data flow, and we use an event from a child component to tell a parent component that a change has occurred. So let's assume that our change has just been made and we want to tell the component above that this change has then been made. Now this component is not a smart component, so what we have to do is then emit another event. So this essentially creates a one-way data flow. So the data flows down from the top, a user makes a change in our third component, it then tells the second component, which then goes up and tells the first component. And at this point, it can then merge the changes in the top component. If it needs to, such as deleting something from a list perhaps, it can then communicate with the backend and actually remove that from the API. Now, after Angular has done this, you will want to actually re-render your data based on what has changed. So for instance, if the change that the user has just made affects these two components, and because we're using one-way data flow, Angular will then go down again and notify the children, if it needs to, that something has actually changed. So the golden rule is that we typically have a container component of some kind, which initiates the data transfer between the components, the data can flow down, the user can interact, and when we're ready, we can fire an event, we can communicate up the components, and if we need to, via this container component, we can communicate with our backend. The service can then be called, updated, and then any new data that needs to be brought back can be brought back. Now, after this change has happened, and if anything needs to be re-rendered, the application will go back and resume its initial state until another change occurs. So this is essentially a high-level example of how we should be thinking with one-way data flow in a component-driven architecture.